The rhythmic pounding of drums echoed across the village, reverberating through the night like a heartbeat. Moonlight spilled over the thatched roofs, casting long, eerie shadows that danced along the dirt paths. In hushed tones, the villagers spoke of the curse tied to the drumbeats, their voices trembling with fear. "Stay inside," warned the elders as they gathered children around the dying embers of the evening fire. The little ones huddled close, their wide eyes reflecting the flickering flames. "Those who dare to dance to that rhythm," the elders whispered, "summon the spirits of the restless dead. Their fate is sealed." The drums continued, their tempo rising, pulling an unseen force toward the village outskirts. In the shadows beyond the village, a hunter crouched low, his frame tense but determined. The drums called to him, a pull he couldn't ignore. His grandmother's words echoed in his mind. "Do not chase what doesn't call your name, Kwame. Leave the dead to rest." But her pleas had fallen on deaf ears. His steps were light, his breath measured. The dense forest loomed ahead, its trees like silent sentinels guarding dark secrets. Kwame's heart was heavy with memories he refused to acknowledge. The day his father disappeared, lured by the same drums. He tightened his grip on the spear in his hand, his resolve unshaken. Tonight he would find the truth. With every step, deeper into the forest, the tales of the drum of Nkrumah played in his mind. "It was no ordinary drum," the griots had said. "Its rhythm awakened spirits better left asleep." Kwame's thoughts turned to the stories of cursed dancers swallowed by the earth or marked for life by unseen forces. Some believed the drum had been crafted by a vengeful spirit, its sound a lure for the desperate or curious. A chill swept through him, but he pressed on. The air grew thick, heavy with the smell of damp earth and something else. Something metallic, like blood. He paused, listening to the drums. They weren't just a sound anymore. They were alive, weaving through the forest like a predator stalking its prey. Ahead, a clearing bathed in moonlight emerged. Kwame stopped, his breath catching as his eyes adjusted to the sight before him. Figures moved in unison, their steps perfectly timed with the drumbeats. Their masks gleamed under the pale light, carved with intricate symbols that seemed to shift and twist. The dancers were not human. They couldn't be. Their movements were too fluid, too synchronized, as though, guided by an invisible hand, the rhythm of the drum controlled them, their bodies bending and twisting unnaturally. Kwame crouched low, his instinct screaming for him to turn back. But he stayed, drawn by the sight and the mystery of their movements. One of the dancers faltered, their steps breaking rhythm. The ground beneath them trembled, cracks snaking outward from where they stood. The dancer froze, their mask tilting upward as if in silent prayer. A glow, pale and ghastly, erupted from the cracks, casting an unholy light across the clearing. Kwame's stomach churned as the dancer let out a strangled cry, their body sinking into the earth. The scream was swallowed by the relentless pounding of the drum, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. The other dancers paused, their heads turning in unison toward the empty space where their companion had stood. Then, without hesitation, they resumed, their movements as precise as before, as if nothing had happened. Kwame's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to steady his breathing, but the moment of horror hadn't gone unnoticed. One of the masked figures stopped, their body rigid. Slowly their head turned in his direction, the mask's hollow eyes locking onto him. His blood ran cold as the figure took a step forward, then another. The drum's rhythm slowed, each beat reverberating like a warning. The figure's movements were deliberate, their intent unmistakable. Kwame's grip tightened on his spear, his mind racing. He didn't need to see their face to know they meant harm. Kwame's body moved before his mind could catch up. He turned and bolted, the sound of the drum chasing him through the forest. The rhythm grew louder, faster, as if the drum itself pursued him. Branches tore at his arms and legs, but he didn't slow down. His breath came in ragged gasps, his only thought to escape the gaze of the masked figure. The stories of the drums, curse rang in his ears. Once it sees you, it never forgets. He didn't stop until the drums faded, replaced by the familiar sounds of the village. But even as he slowed, his heart remained heavy. He had seen too much, and he knew one thing for certain. The village was not safe. The forest loomed ahead, its dense canopy swallowing the moonlight. Quiet footsteps pressed against the soft earth as he moved deeper into the darkness, his spear clenched tightly in one hand. The faint sound of drumming guided him, its rhythm growing louder with each step. In the distance, the traveler stood alone, his back to the trees. His hands moved deliberately, striking the drum of Nkrumah with calculated precision. The beat seemed to ripple through the air, carrying a strange energy that made the hairs on his neck stand on end. A chant began, low and steady, rising with the tempo of the drum. The words were foreign, heavy with power. As the chant grew louder, the traveler paused abruptly, his head tilting slightly, as if sensing a presence. Breath caught in his throat. He pressed himself against the bark of a tree, willing himself to remain unseen. The traveler scanned the shadows for a moment before returning to his rhythmic strikes. The chant resumed, and the drum pulsed, each beat like a heart pounding in fear. The rhythm of the drum quickened, its sound cutting through the still night. A faint glow began to emanate from the drum's surface, flickering like embers caught in the wind. The ground beneath it trembled, tiny cracks spreading outward, releasing whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The whispers grew louder, weaving into the drum's beat. His heart raced as he crouched lower, his eyes fixed on the glowing drum. Suddenly, the traveler struck it harder, the force sending a shockwave through the ground. The glow intensified, illuminating the trees in an eerie, unnatural light. A twig snapped underfoot. The traveler's head snapped toward the sound, his gaze piercing the shadows. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a suffocating silence. He bolted, weaving through the trees as the drum's rhythm quickened behind him. The glow chased him, the whispers now sharp and menacing. He didn't stop until the sound faded, replaced by the pounding of his heart. Morning came with no comfort. The village was restless, whispers passing from one hut to the next. Fields that had been lush the day before were now barren, the crops withered and dry as if drained overnight. Goats and chickens had vanished without a trace, their pens empty and eerily undisturbed. Villagers gathered in clusters, their voices tinged with panic. "It's the curse," one murmured. "The spirits have returned." Another clutched their child who lay feverish and pale. "The drum has awakened," an elder said gravely, their gaze sweeping over the growing crowd. Fear spread quickly, suspicion not far behind. Eyes darted toward one another, searching for someone to blame. The elders stepped forward, their voices firm as they called for calm. But the unease was palpable, feeding on itself like a fire-consuming dry grass. His warnings fell on deaf ears. He stood before the elders, his voice low but steady, as he spoke of what he had seen in the forest. "The traveler," he said, his gaze unwavering. "He is not who he claims to be." The elders exchanged glances, their faces hardening. "You speak of sacred matters," one said sharply. "Your accusations are reckless." Another elder stepped forward, their tone cutting. "You have always been restless, too quick to act. These are not your burdens to carry." He opened his mouth to protest, but the glares from the elders silenced him. Around him, villagers whispered, their voices filled with doubt. Suspicion turned toward him, and he felt the weight of their judgment. He stood alone, his warning ignored, as the sound of the drum echoed faintly in the distance. The path was quiet except for the rustling of leaves and the faint sound of water flowing nearby. He tightened his grip on his spear, his steps cautious. A voice broke the silence, soft yet firm. "You seek answers about the drum." She stood in the shadows, her presence almost ethereal. Her hands moved over small bundles of herbs, the scent of smoke faint around her. "The drum's curse has roots deeper than this village," she continued. "I've seen it before. What it brings, what it takes." He studied her, uncertain if her words carried wisdom or danger. "How do I stop it?" he asked finally. Her eyes narrowed. "To face it, you must understand it. But the truth carries a price. Are you ready to risk everything?" The gathering was tense, voices raised in concern over the village's failing crops and missing livestock. Jabari stood at the center, his voice smooth and deliberate. "We need unity, not division. Suspicion will only worsen our plight." He gestured toward the young hunter, his tone laced with subtle disdain. "Accusations without proof weaken us. You blame me for what you fear, but fear has clouded your judgment." The elders exchanged glances, their resolve faltering under his charm. "He speaks sense," one said reluctantly. Another nodded, adding, "The boy has always been impulsive." Protests fell on deaf ears. The more he tried to argue, the more the elders seemed to turn against him. Jabari's smile lingered as the whispers around the circle solidified into agreement. The fire crackled between them as she spread out a cloth filled with symbols drawn in charcoal. He watched her, skeptical of her methods but desperate for answers. "We'll confront him," she said, her voice steady. "But first we need to understand how the drum binds the spirits." "And if it doesn't work?" he asked, his tone sharp. "Then the village falls," she replied. Her calmness unnerved him, but he nodded, knowing he had no other choice. The air felt heavier as she lit the incense, its smoke curling in unnatural patterns. She placed carved stones in a circle, each one etched with a symbol of protection. "This is forbidden," he muttered, shifting uncomfortably. She didn't look up. "So is allowing the spirits to destroy your home. Do you want answers or not?" She began to chant, her words low and rhythmic. The air grew colder, and the symbols on the stones seemed to glow faintly. A vision flickered before them, a glimpse of the drum's origin. He saw betrayal, bloodshed, and the creation of the curse. As the vision faded, he staggered back, his breath uneven. "Now you know," she said, her voice quiet. "But knowing is only the beginning." The sound of footsteps broke the quiet, and they turned sharply toward the noise. He stepped into the clearing, his gaze cold. "What exactly are you doing out here?" Her hand moved instinctively to the herbs at her side, but his tone stopped her. "Whatever you think you're doing, it won't end well." His words hung in the air, a veiled threat wrapped in a smile. "Be careful where your curiosity leads you," he said before turning away, leaving them to wonder how much he had seen and how much he already knew. The drum sat in the center of the gathering, its presence a silent threat, the village murmured. Anxiously, the elders seated in a tight circle. Jabari stood beside the drum, his confidence unshaken. "You wanted proof," he said, his voice rising above the crowd. "Let me show you the power you fear." He struck the drum, its sound cutting through the air. The ground trembled, and a cold wind swept through the gathering. Shadows began to form, twisting and rising into the shapes of spirits. Their eyes glowed, faintly, their presence undeniable. Panic erupted as villagers scrambled back, some falling to their knees. Jabari's voice was steady. "Bow to their will, and you will be spared. Resist, and you will suffer." He stood frozen, torn between rushing forward and protecting those around him. The spirits' whispers grew louder, their forms more menacing. The village was silent now, fear weighing heavily on every corner. He stood outside the gates, his isolation complete. But the fear that had gripped him earlier had been replaced by determination. He would not let the village fall, not to the drum, and not to Jabari. He turned toward the forest, the faint echo of the drum guiding his steps. If no one else would act, he would. The herbs burned low, their smoke curling in delicate spirals around the group. Symbols drawn carefully in ash and earth adorned their arms. Each mark carried a whispered prayer, a plea for protection. The hunter tightened the grip on his spear, his gaze fixed on the darkened path ahead. "Stay close," he said firmly. The healer clutched a bundle of sacred herbs, their faint scent masking her quiet determination. The young girl followed, her steps steady despite the fear she refused to show. The drumming pulsed through the forest, its rhythm a call they could not ignore. They moved as one, their breath synchronized with the beating drum. The forest seemed alive, its trees shifting as if they were watching. The drum's rhythm guided their path, but with every beat, the shadows around them deepened. Faint flickers of light appeared, twisting and disappearing among the trees. "Don't look away," whispered the healer. "Their power grows when you lose focus." The whispers began, faint at first but growing louder, 1,000 voices murmuring in unison. The young girl pressed forward, her hands trembling but firm. The hunter glanced back at her and nodded, his resolve hardening. The drumming grew louder, pulling them toward its source. The clearing opened before them, bathed in an unnatural glow. The drum sat at its center, pulsing with light that matched its rhythm. Symbols carved into the earth glowed faintly, creating a circle that seemed to hum with energy. He stood within the circle, his back straight, his hands resting lightly on the drum. Shadows surrounded him, their forms twisting and shifting like smoke. His gaze lifted, a smile playing at the corners of his lips. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice calm yet threatening. The shadows moved first, rushing forward like a wave. The hunter dodged to the side, his spear striking out and dissipating one of the forms. Another lunged for the healer, but she raised her herbs, chanting quickly, as the spirit recoiled. The young girl stepped forward, her voice steady as she called out warnings. Her bravery is shown as she placed herself between the healer and an advancing shadow, her movements quick and precise. "You cannot win," he said, his voice echoing over the chaos. His hand struck the drum with force, and the shadows grew larger, their forms solidifying. The healer's chants faltered under the strain, her voice cracking as she struggled to maintain her focus. "We have to stop the drum," she cried. The hunter's gaze locked onto the artifact, but the path was blocked by the summoned forces. The healer's voice broke through the chaos. "The drum binds them. Break the rhythm, and the spirits will fall." The hunter's eyes narrowed as he assessed the path to the drum. It was treacherous, each step blocked by a shifting shadow. His mind raced, searching for an opening. "You have to trust me," she said, her tone firm despite her exhaustion. "The rhythm must be broken, or they will consume us all." The shadows paused, the drum's beat slowing. His voice rang out, filled with anger and pain. Do you know why I seek this power? He asked, his gaze piercing. They took everything from me. He continued, his voice rising. The elders who sit in their high chairs, pretending to protect this village, they betrayed my family, left them to die. His hands tightened on the drum. This is justice. They will feel the pain I've carried for years. The hunter's voice was steady. And what of the innocent lives you've destroyed along the way? He struck the drum again, his rage boiling over. They are collateral. Justice demands sacrifice. The drum glowed brighter as his strikes grew more violent. The shadows began to swirl around him, their movements frantic. The healer's voice rang out, a warning. The drum does not grant power freely. He ignored her, his hands moving faster. The glow intensified, blinding and violent. The shadows turned inward, rushing toward him with terrifying speed. His screams echoed as the spirits consumed him, their forms wrapping around him like chains. The drum's glow exploded outward, and then silence. The light dimmed, leaving only the drum and the faint traces of the symbols in the earth. The hunter stepped forward cautiously, his heart heavy with what he had just witnessed. As he approached the drum, a vision flickered before him. His father stood in the same clearing, his hands raised in a gesture of defiance. The drum's glow surrounded him, and his voice carried through the air. This ends here. The vision faded, leaving the hunter with the weight of understanding. His father had faced the drum before, sealing its power at great cost. The healer's voice was quiet. He gave everything to protect this village. Now it's your turn. He stepped into the circle, his eyes fixed on the drum. The shadows stirred faintly, their strength weakened but not gone. He raised his spear, his mind focused not on vengeance, but on the people he sought to protect. The young girl's face, the healer's steady resolve, the memory of his father. They guided his hand. The spear struck the drum, its surface cracking with a sound like thunder. Light burst forth, the shadows dissipating into the night sky. The symbols faded, their power broken. The forest fell silent, the drum reduced to shards at his feet. He stood still, his chest rising and falling as the weight of the moment settled over him. The drum lay in ruins, its splinters scattered like the remnants of a long-held nightmare. The air, heavy moments ago, grew still and light. The faint glow that had clung to the shadows dissipated into the night sky, leaving behind only silence. He stepped back, the spear still clutched in his trembling hand. The faint echo of the spirit's whispers faded into nothingness. The forest felt alive in a different way now, as though it had exhaled after holding its breath for years. The curse had been broken, its grip on the village shattered alongside the drum. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the drumming was gone. The first light of dawn revealed a village forever changed. The fields, once abundant, were now barren. The livestock pens stood empty, their gates swinging open in the soft morning breeze. Ash from smoldering fires traced the edges of homes, marking the scars left behind. Families moved slowly, their faces etched with exhaustion and grief. Children clung to their mothers, their wide eyes searching for answers that no one could give. A quiet urgency filled the air as villagers began clearing debris, their hands working together to rebuild what had been lost. Despite the physical damage, the wounds of trust ran deeper. Eyes lingered on one another with suspicion, memories of whispered blame still fresh. The village was whole again, but the fractures within its people remained. The elders gathered in the central clearing, their voices low but heavy with the weight of their discussion. "We cannot ignore this any longer," one of them said, his gaze fixed on the ground. "Our silence allowed this curse to fester," another shifted uncomfortably, her hands clutching the edge of her shawl. "We made mistakes, yes, But Jabari's vengeance went too far. The eldest among them raised his voice, silencing the murmurs. Our failures awakened the drum. We must acknowledge this to truly move forward. The conversation lingered, tense but necessary, as the truth of their complicity settled over them like a shadow. He stood before the villagers, his spear set aside, his hand steady. He spoke with a calm strength that belied the fear he had carried for so long. This village was my father's home, and it is mine too. I will protect it, as he did. The people once divided looked to him now with respect. They had seen his bravery, his willingness to face the darkness that none of them could. He was no longer just a hunter. He was their leader. He promised them more than safety. He promised change. The old ways, though sacred, would not bind them again. We will honor tradition, but we will not let it blind us, he said. The murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. She watched him from the edge of the gathering, her heart swelling with pride. His courage had sparked something within her, a determination she hadn't known she possessed. She approached the healer with hesitant but steady steps. "Teach me," she said, her voice clear. "I want to learn to heal, to protect." The healer studied her, a faint smile playing at the corners of her lips. "It will not be easy," she replied. "I'm not afraid," she said simply. The healer nodded, recognizing the same resolve that had driven her brother. Together they began a journey of renewal, one that promised hope for the village's future. The villagers gathered in the forest clearing, where the drum had once pulsed with dark power. This time the air was filled with the soft hum of voices joined in song. The healer led the ritual, her chants guiding the people as they worked to cleanse the forest of its lingering shadows. Small fires burned in a circle, their smoke rising toward the canopy. Offerings of food and herbs were placed on the ground, symbols of gratitude and penance. The songs grew louder, their harmonies weaving through the trees. The tension that had gripped the village began to lift, replaced by a sense of unity. The people sang not just for themselves, but for those they had lost, for the ancestors who had guided them, and for the future they now hoped to build together. The clearing, once a place of fear, became a space of healing, and as the last notes of their song faded into the night, they left the forest renewed, ready to face whatever came next. The village stood quieter now, not in fear but in reflection. The elders gathered once more, not to lead but to listen. Their voices carried the weight of remorse as they spoke of the choices that had led them here. They vowed to preserve the traditions that gave their people strength, while abandoning those that had sown division and pain. Children ran through the village paths, their laughter breaking the solemn air. The elders watched them with a renewed purpose. This was their chance to guide the next generation with wisdom born from hard lessons. The drum's curse had ended, but its memory remained, a shadow that would serve as a warning for years to come. He stood at the edge of the village, gazing at the horizon where the forest met the sky. His mind replayed the events of the past, weeks, each moment heavy with sacrifice and courage. The burden of leadership sat on his shoulders, unfamiliar yet undeniable. His voice was steady as he spoke. "I won't let his sacrifice be forgotten." The promise hung in the air, not just to himself but to the land that bore the scars of their struggles. He turned back toward the village, where life had already begun to stir again. He saw their faces, hopeful, weary, trusting, and he knew his role was more than protector. It was his duty to lead with compassion and ensure they would never face the same darkness again. The symbols of the past remained etched into the walls of the gathering hut, their lines telling stories of ancestors who had once walked the same paths. The villagers gathered beneath them, speaking not of rigid rules, but of the future they would build together. "We honor the ways of our elders," one voice said, "but we will not allow fear to dictate our choices," another added. "The strength of tradition lies in its ability to grow with us." The words spread like ripples, a collective understanding forming. They had learned that honoring the past did not mean being chained to it. Growth and change were not betrayals. They were acts of survival. The forest felt different now, its silence peaceful, rather than foreboding. Two figures walked a familiar path, their hands carrying a young sapling. They reached a small clearing where the earth had been lovingly shaped into a resting place. The sapling was placed gently into the soil, its roots covered with care. "He gave us strength," one of them said softly. "Now we give it back to the land." The sapling stood as a promise, a symbol of renewal and resilience. It marked the end of one story and the beginning of another, its leaves catching the light as though reaching for the future. As they turned to leave, a faint sound stirred the air. The drumming was distant, its rhythm slow and deliberate. It carried no malice, only the weight of choices made and the power they held. The sound lingered, a reminder of what had been overcome and the vigilance required to protect what had been gained. They paused for a moment, their gazes meeting in silent understanding. "The forest never forgets," one said quietly. "And neither should we." The village came into view as they walked together, their steps light but purposeful. The sun bathed the paths in warmth, and the scent of freshly tilled earth filled the air. He looked ahead, his mind painting a vision of what could be. A community united, its people thriving, its traditions woven with wisdom and growth. She walked beside him, her heart set on healing and learning, determined to protect the village from harm with the knowledge she would gain. Their journey was far from over, but the path ahead glowed with promise. Together they stepped into the future, their hearts steady and their spirits strong.